Jojo's Bizarre Adventure is a genre-defining masterpiece. Even from the beginning, Araki was bringing an entirely new approach to shonen storytelling, one that immediately stood out and forced every other manga to adapt. Seriously, take a look at the cute hijinks of early Dragon Ball, and then remember it was published alongside Dio feeding a baby to its mother. This was unlike anything readers had seen before, completely groundbreaking stuff, and yet, many fans of the series are a little too comfortable talking trash about it, often calling Phantom Blood the worst part.
You prefer part one over...
Okay.
That's what I want to know. That was the opinion, right? That's what I want to know. I totally agree with these takes, but it was just like, then you say, oh yeah, part one's better.
It didn't really like flow as a story in my opinion.
I agree, and it definitely wasn't, the narrative wasn't like the strong part of part one.
Obviously, I disagree with this. Phantom Blood is ridiculously good, and I'm tired of hearing otherwise, especially when it's obvious that most people hadn't even thought about it for a second. This isn't just a bunch of meaningless action scenes. It's a really profound story that shows us the best and worst of humanity, asking us what it really means to live a good life. In other words, this is a breakdown on why everyone is wrong about Phantom Blood.
Breakdown, breakdown. Listen, breakdown, breakdown. Listen, breakdown, breakdown. Breakdown, breakdown.
The reason I'm so passionate about defending Phantom Blood is because every time I read it, I'm surprised at how much substance it has. Araki is someone who understands storytelling at a deep level. He doesn't just draw beautiful, dynamic pictures. He's good at identifying what matters most in a narrative, squeezing the most out of these moments for the purposes of drama. The over-the-top reactions, the weirdly creative violence, and of course, the posing, all work towards achieving this goal. But what really ties it all together is the careful way Araki arranges his scenes for maximum effect. The way he achieves this is with clever use of one of the fundamental principles of storytelling, action and reaction, or cause and effect. To be more specific, when constructing a scene, an author really only has two ways they can make the audience care about a character. You either show them in conflict where they have to display their particular strengths, or you show their reaction to an event, where it's more about their inner journey as they process their emotions and decide what to do next. Both are necessary for a good story, but authors usually favor one over the other either due to genre expectations or personal style. You see, the ratio of action versus reaction in a story is what directly determines the pacing of it. More action and conflict makes narratives feel quicker and exciting, with the trade-off that you don't have as much time to explore the characters, and therefore the audience has less emotional investment in them. The other side of the coin is that if you dwell too much on emotions, you risk boring the audience, since there isn't anything actually happening in terms of plot. Now, this might sound obvious to some of you, but the reason I'm going out of my way to explain it is to give context to my real point, which is that Jojo's Bizarre Adventure focuses far more on reactivity than a typical shonen story.
NANI?! NANI?! YAMERO!
Even during the action scenes, there's always a heavy emphasis placed on how the characters are reacting to the events. Fights are always about understanding the opponent and psychologically maneuvering around each other until someone can land a critical blow. It's a unique dynamic where character development directly correlates to power level, so it still has a tangible influence on the action, and this makes it really easy for the audience to never get bored by the reactivity. This is also evident to me by the sheer amount of memes produced by the manga and anime. Again, I feel like I'm pointing out the obvious here, but a large portion of memes on the internet are reactions, and the fact that Jojo's Bizarre Adventure has so many over-the-top reactions makes it really easy to share over the internet. Yes. More importantly, this emphasis on reaction is the thematic core of the story, and the secret to what makes Jojo fights so memorable. The physical conflict is less important than the inner journey they're going through. That's the key to understanding Jojo. It's very important that the people we follow in the story always display strong egos, and it isn't by accident. What tends to drive every fight is how a character evolves once confronted with a challenge to their identity. This theme permeates the entire story, and once you see it, it's hard not to spot every time. The most obvious example of this is the rivalry between Dio and Jonathan. The dynamic between them actually lays the philosophical foundation for the rest of the series, all from the very beginning. You see, Every Jojo part is actually a subtle meditation on the concept of fate. More specifically, it's about the role that destiny plays in our lives, like whether or not choosing to be a better person matters in the long run, or if our circumstances are what ultimately define us. In the manga, most of the first chapter is dedicated to introducing Dio as a character, not Jonathan. It's very fitting to me that it starts this way because in a story that focuses so much on reactivity, it's only logical for the villain to be someone who's ambitious and proactive. Jonathan, on the other hand, is the exact opposite, passive and reactive. This is one of the most common criticisms of Phantom Blood, but I actually really like this choice because it embodies the unconventional values of the narrative. In a normal story, Dio would be the protagonist. He's talented, he has a goal, and he has a tragic backstory, which would make for a compelling underdog story. But here, we're being asked to reconsider our biases. The anime does take a slightly different approach. There, we're shown a montage comparing the lives of Dio and Jonathan, which largely achieves the same result. The contrast in their upbringing is asking us to empathize with the villain, putting him in an underdog position where we almost root for his success. Immediately afterwards, narration takes over to start talking about the Industrial Revolution. More specifically, it focuses on the concept of social mobility and the newly emerging middle class, which, while subtle, neatly reveals the theme of fate this story is trying to explore, framing it as a massive social shift that was already underway. You see, for the longest time, the average person had no say about their place in society. Fate was something absolute. If you were born into a peasant family, there was little you could do to escape a life of poverty. The idea of choosing your destiny was frowned upon and even considered sacrilegious, depending on the ruling class of the area. This is because kings back then derived their political power from the divine right to rule. In other words, the nobility were literally chosen by heaven to lead the peasants, and questioning this was the same as questioning God. By the time Phantom Blood takes place, the European aristocracy had been abusing their power for centuries, so a lot of resentment had built up towards them. In the story, this attitude is immediately shown in Jonathan's introduction when he's beaten up by some bullies just for being rich. This is also what makes Dio so despicable yet compelling. He takes advantage of a valid resentment people had against nobility and then twists it for his own purposes, using it to justify cruelty. And so the clash between Jonathan and Dio isn't just personal rivalry. It symbolizes the fall of classical Western values and ensuing nihilism of the modern age. The second they meet, there is immediate friction. A confrontation is obviously inevitable just due to how differently they see the world. Araki, however, then uses storytelling technique common in professional wrestling to keep the audience hooked, breaking up the fight just before it starts. And this leads me to the first essential step to a good JoJo fight, the build-up. More often than not, this is the most important and memorable part of a story. I'm jumping ahead a little, but one of the best examples of this is in part 2. Joseph's reaction to Caesar's death is probably the most impactful scene in Battle Tendency, and it's technically only build-up for the upcoming fight with Wamu.
Caesar!
This is also why people remember Dio kicking poor Danny, but largely ignore the boxing match it led to. Of course, it doesn't help that the next moment of build-up immediately overshadows this, when Dio steals a kiss from Marina and says the meme.
このディオだ!
All of this finally culminates into our first real fight of the story. I say real because so far Jonathan has only been shown getting his ass kicked by everyone. Those weren't even a contest, so it's hard to count them. Needless to say, Dio has had the upper hand in every single confrontation, to the point where Jonathan feels it's impossible to ever beat him. Now, however, we can finally see the point I started with, which is that JoJo fights are primarily about the psychological development of the combatants. Even though, objectively speaking, it was only a short scuffle, both of their identities would be fundamentally shaped by this encounter. Jonathan has been pushed to his limit by all the torture. He comes to the realization that, even if he loses, if he doesn't fight now, he will have to put up with it for the rest of his life. He wasn't a stranger to the situation, though. The one strength Jonathan had already shown in the story is that he will always fight for what he cares about, even if he can't win. It's literally how he's introduced in the story when fighting the bullies. Meanwhile, Dio realizes that he enjoys hurting people a little too much for his own good, since it literally created an opening for his defeat, and he discovers that Jonathan gets stronger with every loss, forcing him to take a more indirect approach. Yet again, just like in pro wrestling, the fight gets broken up before it escalates, and we're left with an inconclusive resolution as to who would win. Of course, the fact that Dio proceeds to burn Danny alive lets us know that his rivalry is far from over.
2時間眠った。そして目を覚ましてからしばらくして、ダニーが死んだことを思い出し、泣いた。
The ensuing time skip only generates more anticipation for the inevitable rematch. We're shown Jonathan and Dio have a very public friendship, but their inner monologues soon reveal it's all performative. I've always thought this rugby sequence was a nice touch from Araki. It does a lot for the story despite how short it is. Both characters' strengths are seamlessly highlighted here, showing how effective they can be when working together. It reminds me a little of Al and Light, or Susako and Lelouch, or even Guts and Griffith. There's an almost tragic element to their relationship where we're left wondering what could have been. It also makes Dio look like an even bigger piece of shit, because it emphasizes that killing Lord Joestar served no purpose whatsoever. Dio graduated at the top of his class as a lawyer, and was more than capable of achieving greatness on his own. He even says as much at the beginning. That means his ultimate goal isn't to have a good life, it's to make sure nobody else is ever better than him, even at the cost of his own humanity. This inferiority complex is what drives him to such extremes, and it's only made worse by the fact that he actively chooses to be this way. We know this because, when caught by Jonathan, the first excuse he gives is his upbringing, claiming he's only a product of his environment. This, however, is a blatant lie. We're quickly shown he only said it to make Jonathan lower his guard. In my opinion, this is the final nail in the coffin for Dio. You see, more often than not, people have this notion that evil is done out of ignorance. They believe this because they see evil as something ultimately harmful to everyone, including the person who does it. So it's strange to them that anyone would willingly choose to do it. From this point of view, it's then easy to assume that the only reason a person could be evil is because they don't know any better. And if you just show them the error of their ways, you can free them from their ignorance and they'll automatically be a better person. This logic is exactly what got Lord Joestar killed. Don't fall for it. That's how you let cycles into your life. Dio always knew exactly what he was doing. It's vital to understanding his character that everything he does is of his own volition. Being aware enough of his circumstances to understand how they influenced him and still doubling down on this behavior means he never had a desire to better himself in the first place. Therefore, becoming a vampire isn't him just rejecting his humanity on a biological level. With this act, he's completely dismissing the inherent value of life and all the things that make it meaningful. To him, life is a zero-sum game where you extract as much as you can out of people before they do the same to you. When you think about it, it's hard not to see this type of vampirism as an allegory for people who actually exist in our society. Concepts like love and honesty are indistinguishable from elaborate lies under this worldview, things made to control the weak. Dio has no problem throwing them away because they're not real to him. A more wise person, though, would argue that they're what makes life worth living. That's why I find it noteworthy that Speedwagon is there to quickly dismiss Dio. He serves as the best foil in this situation since he comes from a similar background but still chooses to live with dignity and respect. We already know that in the future, he's going to become one of the most influential men on the planet, far wealthier than the Joestar family, which further proves the flaws in Dio's nihilism, because someone even more underprivileged than him would go on to achieve greatness without any need for treachery. Jonathan, however, represents something far more profound here. The death of his father symbolizes the death of his innocence, but on a thematic level, it signifies the loss of chivalric values at the turn of the century. You see, like I alluded to before, the 19th century was an era of radical change. Science had finally stepped out of the shadow of religion and philosophy, which completely changed the way people saw the world. This is because scientific advancement is what ultimately enabled the Industrial Revolution, making it impossible to deny its worth. There's nothing inherently wrong with this, but it did put into question many of the values people took for granted back then. More and more, science kept disproving superstitious thinking, with theories like evolution and natural selection going against widely held beliefs found in the Bible. This started happening so much that it became harder for people to believe in abstract things beyond our material reality, which then had the unintended side effect of eroding the moral foundations of Western society. Turns out, the second you imply humans aren't a product of intelligent design and that we're just slightly more complex apes that randomly came about, some people begin to doubt the sacredness of human life in the first place. After all, if we're just animals, and animals kill other animals, then the only hierarchy that exists is the food chain, and material power is the only thing that matters there.
貴様
一体何人の命をその傷のために吸い取った。
お前は今まで食ったパンの枚数を覚えているのか。
And so, this upcoming battle isn't just a physical confrontation between Dio and Jonathan. It also represents the struggle between two opposite paths humanity can take to find meaning in the modern age. Nihilism feels very tempting and confronted by the cruel realities of our world. Good people are often exploited and punished for their virtues, while many times the immoral and dishonest seem to flourish without ever seeing justice. Lord Joestar is a perfect example of this. He did everything he could to help Dio and his father, and they both made him look like a fool for it. After experiencing this, it would be easy to assume there's no point to being a good person. And yet, Lord Joestar feels no regret for his actions. With his last words, he even tells Jonathan to not hold this against Dio, thinking he must have done something wrong for his adopted son to turn out like this. This act of responsibility was so powerful that it provoked an inner transformation within Jojo. The concept of inheriting a person's will is a key theme in this story. It's so important that it literally shows up in every part. During Phantom Blood itself, we see it again later on when Sapelli sacrifices himself and passes on his Hamon energy. In both cases, we are being shown the true value of ideals. They might be intangible, but by choosing to uphold them, it can have a ripple effect, influencing the world in a meaningful way far after we are gone. This is why Jonathan chooses to fight a monster like Dio where a normal person would just run away, so that the ideals of his father could continue to exist through him. More specifically, it's communicating the idea that just because something isn't your fault doesn't mean it isn't your responsibility. The emphasis on reactivity that I've been talking about is on full display here. Jonathan's reaction to his father's death is given a lot of weight in the build-up to the fight, with his grief being given an entire page at the end of a chapter. My greater point, that character development is the essence of a Jojo fight, can also be seen in this battle. Jonathan's psychological growth is what ultimately gives him an edge over Dio, who, while far stronger than before, is still the same person and hasn't matured at all. It's been over a decade since I first saw this fight, and it's still one of my favorite in all of anime. The way Dio is presented at first makes him seem invincible. He kills almost everyone in the room with such ease that it just feels impossible to defeat him. Jonathan, however, isn't fazed by this. As discussed earlier, he has been fighting unwinnable battles since childhood, which means he's perfectly suited for this task. Little by little, he studies Dio and learns his limitations until formulating a plan. I really like the logic he uses to figure it out because it says so much about his mindset. First, Speedwagon shoots Dio and they notice his regeneration. Then Jonathan tries to set him on fire, but that doesn't work either. At this point, every single attempt to fight back has failed, and instead of giving up, Jonathan just doubles down on it, correctly deducing he only needed a stronger flame. This is why I keep mentioning the importance of character psychology in these fights, because a strong mind is what usually ends up being the deciding factor in them. Later on, stands would become a more refined vehicle for this idea. They function like the manifestation of a person's psyche, with powers that match their worldview, so when they battle, it's a more literal clash of spirits. In Phantom Blood, though, this idea is already present in an elegantly subtle way. Jonathan is constantly proving there's a genuine pragmatic value in abstract things like mental resilience, or to use his own words, it's not a trick, it's courage. Dio, on the other hand, also shows us the dangers of never fixing your mental weaknesses. Just like before, he got drunk on his own power and underestimated Jonathan. He could have easily stepped out of the mansion and waited for it to burn down, but his need to personally kill Jojo blinded him to the trap. The ending sequence of this fight is probably my favorite example of everything I've been talking about. It literally blends all of these themes into an epic climax. Jonathan tackles Dio into Inferno, ready to sacrifice himself for the greater good, until Dio overpowers him and breaks free.
Get back, Jojo!
For a moment, it feels like there's no possible way for Jojo to recover. He still doesn't give up though, and salvages the situation with clever use of everything at his disposal. Dio tries to overpower him again, but Jonathan has already learned from his previous attempt, bracing himself to hold on despite shattering his bones. Then he makes a desperate plea to his father, asking for his strength, and this prayer is seemingly answered when Dio is pierced through the chest by a statue.
ジョースター家の守護神慈愛の女神像。よくも貴様こんな忘れていた。子供の頃からあった侮ってはいけない奴の爆発力を。
This moment feels incredibly significant to me in light of all the themes we've been discussing so far. The fact that Dio is literally defeated by a work of art almost speaks for itself, acting as a counterpoint to his nihilism. You see, when a human makes something like a sculpture, they're actually giving a physical form to an abstract idea they hold in their mind. And so this depiction of the goddess of love is more than just decoration. It's a concrete manifestation of the Joestar family's values. One could argue it was just random luck and that Araki just did it because it was a cool visual, but I disagree with that. The statue was there because the Joestar family wanted it there, and the reason they wanted it there is because they valued the concept of love. That means that just by appreciating its beauty, this guardian spirit was able to protect them in a very real way. All in all, it's a powerful statement on how art, as an extension of our ideals, can help us triumph over nihilism. That's not the full picture, though. It's easy to say, just appreciate the abstract value of life, brah, but it's a whole other thing to put it into practice. And so the rest of Phantom Blood is really about testing Jonathan's newfound virtue. While Dio was a threat, the conflict so far had only been on a small scale, since the Joestar family were the only ones who had something truly at stake. Now, the rest of these fights are going to be focusing on the world at large. The next villain we're introduced is Jack the Ripper. Within the narration itself, his inclusion is very deliberately portrayed as a symptom of modernity, a new type of evil known as the serial killer. Up until then, cities just weren't big enough to support that type of mass murder, so people like Jack the Ripper are sometimes seen as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. More importantly, in the story, Dio manages to win him over using rhetoric from a popular sentiment of the time, the theory of great men. It's often proposed that greatness is simply the capacity to take drastic measures when necessary, and that morality only applies to the masses to keep the herd in check. This is something that was even alluded to earlier in the story, back when Dio forced himself onto Erina. The boys watching him were quick to praise him, saying that he does the things others wish they could. From this perspective then, goodness is really more a lack of courage, and that makes it a weakness. Baron Sapelli, however, proceeds to argue against this notion when fighting Jack the Ripper. To him, courage is acknowledging your fear and making it your own. This is where human greatness comes from, knowing you are vulnerable but still choosing to fight. It works in the context of a battle, but I really think the message goes a little deeper than that. There's even a clear example of it earlier in the story during Jonathan's childhood. Erina was someone who made life worth living for him during his lowest point. Dio noticed this and quickly exploited it as a weakness. On the surface, it seems like he proved this point since it tore a rift between them. But it's also what led Jojo to finally growing a pair and kicking his ass. The point is that having values will always look like a weakness, since they can be used against you. But they are still worth the risk, and there's genuine strength in having them. That's why Dio and Jack the Ripper are not courageous people. They're cowards who are too afraid to care about anything other than themselves. Of course they can act without fear. They're undead monsters incapable of feeling pain. They're not risking anything. Cruelty doesn't make anyone brave, though. In fact, it's usually the easy solution. Allow me to demonstrate. This is Bulbasaur. Bulbasaur. Isn't he cute? He's just a little guy. A level 1 Pokemon that only knows tackle. Bulbasaur, Bulbasaur. Isn't he adorable? In other words, he's the perfect victim. Baba? That's right! If you don't like, subscribe, and comment Save Bulbasaur right now, I will gut him like a Magikarp. Bulbasaur! 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 See what I mean? Ultimately, no matter how much they try to glorify it, it's all just an excuse to act selfishly and do harm, which is exactly what Dio is exploiting. This corruption of values is actually his most dangerous weapon. In an interview, Araki once mentioned that what made Dio so evil to him wasn't just his supernatural powers, but more than that, his ability to control others. He largely accomplishes this by examining their beliefs, twisting them for his own purposes, something he continued to do in future parts, even when he wasn't physically there. Another example of this is also present in the upcoming fight with the Knights. These men are shown as victims of the monarchy, betrayed by a ruling elite that used their honor against them. In a way, this is the other side of the coin to Lord Joestar's dilemma. The Knights were just like him, virtuous people who had their better nature exploited. The key difference between them, however, is that the Knights ended their lives cursing the world, regretting the fact that they had ever lived that way. After their resurrection, they pledged loyalty to someone even more evil than the person who betrayed them. But they're either blind to this fact or don't seem to care. Their need for vengeance is far more important than anything else. And yet, Dio is quietly surprised to see that they still hold on to some of their honor. A part of him is dissatisfied that they're not completely corrupted, but like always, he's unable to understand or respect the power behind it, which ends up backfiring after he leaves. Buford the Knight then proceeds to fight Jonathan, only to find himself redeemed because of this virtue. He tries to reject his humanity at first, but keeps making honorable choices that inevitably pave the way for his defeat. I also think it's important to note that Jonathan literally won by recognizing Buford's pain. Although subtle, this act of empathy reaffirms the lesson Sapelli had given him in the prior fight. Being alive means being vulnerable, which means that pain and betrayal are inevitable. But that's not a good enough reason to curse the world and give up on everything. This idea is also carried over into Poco's character arc in the next fight. During the flashback, his sister basically reiterates the value of courage through a more pragmatic lens. Poco's issue was that he was afraid of pain, which stopped him from taking action. His sister then frames the problem in a very wise way.
痛いのって怖い。あんたいつまでも大人になっても一人じゃ何にもできない方がもっと怖いとは思わないの?
He slapped him anyway just to drive the point home, which is that life is going to be painful regardless of what you do, so you might as well not let it rule over you. It doesn't end there though. Poco's psychological growth is then immediately contrasted in the following scene when Sapelli enters the fight.
そなたは死への宿命を背負うことになるぞ。ついに来たか、あの予言の時が。これが運命なら、あるがまま受け入れよう。チェペリさん、あんた今なんて。
I love this moment so much. It still gives me goosebumps after all these years. Unlike Poco or Jonathan, who still have room to mature, Sapelli is someone who is at the end of his journey. Years beforehand, he had already accepted that his destiny would be a painful death, and when prophecy came true, he willingly stepped forward with no regrets. This inevitably brings us back to the theme of fate that ties all of Jojo's bizarre adventure together. What do we do when confronted with a reality we can't change? Why does being a good person matter if everything is set in stone? At that point, is it even a choice? Well, in this story, the short answer is that yes, it is a choice, and it's an important one to make, even if it ends in failure. Master Tom Petty was very clear saying that, if Sapelli wanted to, he could have just walked away and avoided dying that night. This is meaningful because it implies his future wasn't predetermined, or at least it wasn't until he made the conscious choice to go down this road. It's a far more nuanced approach to fate, where it's more about rising to the occasion when destiny calls, rather than an invisible force that's controlling everything. This is something that actually remains consistent throughout future JoJo parts. In fact, whenever the universe seemingly conspires in favor of someone, it usually benefits the villains, not the heroes. All in all, Sapelli's sacrifice is a highly symbolic act that asserts humanity's free will over the universe. Just like with Lord Joestar, his actions would influence Jonathan from beyond the grave, allowing him to overcome Tarkus the Knight with ease.
そしてジョジョはまた受け継ぐ彼の生き方とその精神を。
さよなら、ゼペリさん。
Although mighty, it's also shown that the power he obtained didn't come without a cost. Speedwagon is the first to notice, commenting that Jonathan had a darker expression after the incident. This is a sign that, little by little, Dio had chipped away at everything he loved, with every encounter damaging his innocence until he couldn't hold on to it anymore. We can see the full extent of this when he finally confronts Dio again, saying he just wants to kill him for revenge.
正直なところ、今のジョナサン・ジョースターは恨みを晴らすために出よう。貴様を殺すのだ。
There's also many hints of it in the way he fights now. His weakness used to be cheap tricks that caught him off guard. Now, not only is he wise enough to avoid them, he even integrates them into his arsenal. Dio has to recognize that he's improved at fighting, but even then it seems like their skills are evenly matched. Ultimately, the deciding factor is the point I've kept repeating all this video: character development. Once again, Dio keeps trying the same thing, thinking he can overpower anything, while Jonathan learns from his failures and adapts his strategy with every attempt. This capacity for growth is the key difference between them. Dio, however, is incapable of understanding it because it requires accepting weakness. After all, why would he care about growing if he already thinks he's perfect? It's the lesson Baron Sapelli had given Jojo appearing once again. By accepting our vulnerabilities, we can learn to transcend them and achieve what's seemingly impossible. And yes, our convictions can be used against us, but without them, we all just evolve into predatory animals.
違う。信念さえあれば人間に不可能はない。人間は成長するのだ。してみせる。
Jonathan's growth is one of the most satisfying yet subtle transformations in all of shonen. I say this because it's easy to take for granted just how weak he used to be. If we look at it objectively, he's an unbeatable powerhouse for most of the story, and yet his progression is done so smoothly that we don't really question it. I also want to point out that Jonathan is the only JoJo protagonist who gets this type of development, which makes his story really unique to me. It's interesting to me that every other JoJo already starts off as a badass, so we never really get to see them grow like this again. Instead, as the story progresses, more emphasis is placed on the side characters and villains, who do get a chance to grow and become memorable as a result. In my opinion, this is yet another aspect of Fate that is being subtly shown in the narrative. It's trying to communicate that one doesn't need to be a Joestar in order to be important. This gets explored more and more in subsequent parts until we end up with someone like Bruno Bucciarati, who is arguably just as much of a protagonist as Giorno is in Part 5. In Phantom Blood, though, this idea is already being presented to us in the ending, with Jonathan's death. The story going on without him indicates to the audience that it's not about one specific individual destined for greatness, and that it's really about the legacy he creates for others with his noble actions. From personal experience, I can tell you that this is one of the more controversial aspects of Part 1. Whenever I try to introduce someone to JoJo's, it's usually a 50-50 split on whether or not they continue the story after this moment. Some people just don't like the idea of Jonathan dying. It can feel like a bit of a rug pull after watching him overcome so much adversity. Furthermore, on the surface, it can also look like it undermines the moral message of the story, since the entire journey can feel pointless if Dio survives in the end. I want to push back on this, however, because I think this is literally the point it's trying to make. When Jonathan and Dio face each other one last time, Dio has actually gone through a radical personality change. Not only was he humbled by his defeat, he no longer sees Jonathan as someone inferior to him, acknowledging that he wouldn't have become so powerful without him. It all boils down to the fact that Jonathan constantly forced him to admit his own weaknesses, pushing him to grow stronger. It's actually something that carries over into Part 3. Dio is a lot more careful when fighting Jotaro, remembering how quickly Jonathan could turn the tables on him, which I think is a really cool detail that shows his evolution. There is a caveat to this, though. While he now sees the value of respecting your opponent and personal growth, it's only through the lens of obtaining power, which still makes it an incomplete understanding of virtue. We can actually see this when he offers Jonathan a painless death as a show of respect. This is important to note because, as we discussed with Buford the Knight and with Poco, pain is an important part of being alive. Dio thinking that he's being merciful by removing it is a sign that he still doesn't quite understand the value of life. You see, Jonathan would rather be in pain if it means he gets a better shot to live, but Dio, being a hedonist, can't comprehend this. To him, killing Jonathan is just another part of his destiny, something inevitable that he needs to do, and in a way, he's right. Thanks to Baron Sapelli, though, we already know that fate is a little more complicated than that. Dio is using fate to absolve himself of any responsibility for his actions, but he doesn't realize this is exactly what brings about his downfall. He came into that boat of his own volition and chose Jonathan as his new body for no reason other than petty narcissism. What he didn't expect, like always, is that Jonathan would fight back even when it was hopeless, which ended up making all the difference. The way it played out is thematically satisfying to me because while Dio has learned to respect Jonathan's strength, his henchman still hasn't and proceeds to ruin everything because of it.
何構うものか。ディオ様はこいつを高く評価しすぎですぜ。やばい、ワンチャン。まずい。
In the end, Jonathan embracing Dio is also his way of embracing his fate. He understands that their destinies are intertwined because of who they choose to be, which he describes as a bizarre type of friendship. The use of the word bizarre here stands out to me as particularly meaningful. It's literally in the title, so let's unpack what it's trying to say. I mentioned near the beginning of this video that the people we follow in the story always have strong egos, and the reason for this is quite simple. Having strong convictions, whether they're good or bad, requires a certain amount of individuality and willingness to stand out, which will always make you look like a weirdo to the vast majority of people who don't live this way. In that sense, Jonathan and Dio are one and the same. It's very rare to find someone who can truly understand this, so even if they're enemies, there's a certain kinship between them that can't be denied. It might seem lonely or bleak, but there's also a hopeful message being shown here. Since, in this story, fate is influenced by the choices we make, it's almost inevitable that people who choose to live in a bizarre way will gravitate towards each other. It's an idea that would eventually turn into the adage of Stan users are drawn to Stan users, which can bring not just conflict but also camaraderie.
待て、ナルンちゃん、ミスター。こいつは敵ではないようだ。
This is also why every Jojo from now on is going to be a bit of an asshole. Their strong personalities are what allow them to overcome adversity, even when it seems impossible. And it's also a reflection of a change in values as the 20th century began. Like I mentioned before, this was an era of radical change. Society transitioned from a mythical interpretation of the world, with empires and feudalism, to a more secular perspective, with capitalism and communism becoming the two prevailing ideologies. Jonathan represents a sort of naive morality that just wouldn't work anymore. Just like the concept of aristocracy itself, he needed to die in order to make way for something better. His gentleman values just weren't appropriate for the modern age. Or to put it differently, he was literally too good for the new world, which is why he died on his way to America. Now, instead of being martyrs, this new generation of JoJos would go on to actually survive their adventures. It's genius because Araki has already proven that he's willing to kill a protagonist, so that tension actually spills over into every other part. In Battle Tendency, for instance, Joseph attending his own funeral wouldn't have worked nearly as well if Jonathan hadn't already set a precedent. And so, Jonathan died in obscurity, with the general public never knowing that he saved the world. His descendants would certainly know about him, though, and his actions would go on to influence others even a century later, when Dio returns. This leads us to the biggest point of contention people always have with endings like this one. What's the point of fighting evil if it's just going to keep happening? Time and time again, Dio is thoroughly defeated only for him to get lucky and somehow survive. He even obtains Jonathan's body in the end. It's not unreasonable then to conclude that Jonathan failed and that his sacrifice was meaningless. My counter-argument against this is crass, but it gets the point across. You see, when you go to the bathroom and take a dump, do you not wipe your ass afterwards, or at least clean it? I sure hope so, but that leads me to my next question. Why bother? You're gonna have to do it again in the near future. Isn't cleaning yourself pointless if you're just gonna be dirty again? No! Of course not! And the reason is pretty self-explanatory. Having a clean ass is worth it, even if it's temporary because, you know, it's better than putting up with shit all the time. Could you imagine if people applied this reasoning to other things in life? Like, why bother taking medicine? You're just gonna get sick again. Or why even eat? You're gonna be hungry again in a few hours. It's a type of logic that might make sense on the surface, but falls apart upon a closer look. That said, the approach that Araki took to deliver this message is one I really appreciate. He doesn't preach on a soapbox, like me. He just lets his characters' actions speak for themselves. This circles us back to the emphasis he always places on character development, especially on the villains. Its purpose is to gently nudge the audience into reflecting on the way they live. This message of empathy is present in all of JoJo's bizarre adventure. Although in recent times this term has morphed into a bit of a buzzword, I really think its portrayal here is the best example of the value behind it. Jonathan actually demonstrates this when he first fought Speedwagon. His ability to put himself in the shoes of others is what ultimately won over his biggest ally.
僕は父のためにここに来た。だから蹴る瞬間、君にも父や母や兄弟がいるはずだと思った。君の父親が悲しむことはしたくない。
Furthermore, Sapelli outright says it when fighting Jack the Ripper.
その1、もし自分が敵ならと相手の立場に身を置く思考。
Empathy isn't about being nice to others. It's about understanding where they're coming from and acting accordingly, whether they're a friend or foe. Lord Joestar, for all of his virtues, couldn't understand people like Theo and his father, which is what ultimately led to his demise. Unfortunately, most people are too scared to do this because it means acknowledging they might be similar to someone they despise. A character like Dio, for example, is so easy to hate because of how real his motivations feel. The resentment, the scheming, the inflated ego, these are things we often encounter in our lives, so even when he turns into a magical vampire, his actions still feel grounded in reality. None of it would work if Araki hadn't built sympathy for him in the beginning, which is why I think starting the story with him was such a smart move. It's asking us to put ourselves in his shoes, and by identifying with him, even for just a little bit, we can't help but see a part of ourselves in him and how human he ironically is. One of my favorite scenes in the anime is this small moment during the montage in the first episode. Dio gets his face shoved into a plate of food after winning a game of chess. He sees the fork and, for a moment, he's tempted to use it as a weapon, but quickly thinks twice about it. No matter how ruthless or despicable Dio turned out to be, I just feel sorry for him at this moment. He played by the rules and won fair and square, only to have someone more powerful than him invalidate it. This is a nuance I really appreciate about JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. It's something many people can relate to, so in a way, Dio's story can be a warning on the dangers of resentment. Even though his frustrations were valid, it's very easy to go down a harmful road when you feel like the world owes you something. And once again, this brings us back to the emphasis on reactivity and character growth I've been discussing this entire video. It's all in service to the message Araki is trying to communicate. Every other JoJo part after this is going to build upon it, even if it's not outright stated. For example, Joseph saying his opponent's lines before they do is a sign of a strong sense of empathy.
お前は次になんでメリケンのこと分かったんだこの野郎という。なんでメリケンのこと分かったんだこの野郎。
Jotaro is also the same. Despite being cold and distant on the surface, he's really good at understanding people, and it always gives him an edge. Ultimately, this theme of empathy is the way Araki celebrates human greatness. Not from our capacity to do harm, but from our ability to create meaning in our lives with ideals that go beyond a nihilistic power struggle. This finally leads me to the opening thesis of this essay. Why do I say that everyone is wrong about Phantom Blood? Is it because everyone needs to like what I like, and my opinion is an objective fact?
No.
Of course not. The point I'm trying to make here is more nuanced. So many JoJo fans just say Phantom Blood is the worst part without leaving any room for discussion about it. This opinion has been repeated so much that it's given it an unearned reputation about it being bad, which is where I think most people go wrong. There's also the fact that a lot of fandom only engages with JoJo's on an ironic level, which makes having a discussion about its themes more difficult. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying JoJo memes are bad. In fact, this video is full of them because I enjoy them too. I just think it's a shame that people dismiss Araki's work when it has so much to offer. Yes, there's a lot of silly moments, but there's just as many moments that are thought-provoking and profound. If there's anything I hope people get out of this video, it's that JoJo's Bizarre Adventure as a whole has genuine artistic merit. It's not just mindless entertainment. There's a deeper element to it that I believe deserves to be recognized more. You don't have to agree with my interpretation of this story. If you come to a different conclusion than me, as long as I've given you something to think about, then I feel like I've done my job. Anyway, I think I've spoken long enough for today. Thank you for watching the video, and remember, like and subscribe, or else.